Basically, you know who I am, but I will introduce myself briefly and say my name is Polly Schisler, and I'm a professor in the Department of Near Eastern Religions and Civilizations. And it's my pleasure this evening to be able to provide an introduction to the second of the Dumanian family-sponsored lectures on Armenian history and society. So tonight we have the good fortune to hear a lecture not only on the topic of Armenian history and society, but from the gentleman who is in fact the Dumanian visiting professor here at the University of Chicago this year. And my colleague, Conscription of Armenians, is going to provide the specific introduction to our distinguished speaker, but before we go there, I do want to say, as ever, that the department feels extremely fortunate to be able to offer both this series of lectures and to have a visiting professor in the field of Armenian studies on an annual basis. That's a real privilege and luxury for us. And as always, we want to thank the Dumanian family, and in particular Mrs. Edna Dumanian, for their continued support of this very valuable program. And having said that, I am going to ask Professor Harutyunyan to introduce our speaker.
Hi there. So I know that everyone knows me, so thank you for the introduction. And we really today are very privileged to have Professor Kilikdahi here for this event. So I'll introduce him in short notes. So Ohannes Kilikdahi, hope I don't butcher it. After having double major BA degrees from Sociology and Political Science Department of Boğaziçi University, Istanbul, continued to his doctoral studies at the Department of History of the same university. He was a research fellow at the Near Eastern Studies of University of Michigan, Ann Arbor in 2012 and 2013. He took his PhD in 2014 with the dissertation named as Socio-Political Reflections and Expectations of the Ottoman Armenians After the 1908 Revolution, Between Hope and Despair. Between 2003 and 2017, he lectured at Istanbul Bilgi University Sociology Department on Social and Political History of the Late Ottoman Empire and Modern Turkey. From 2017 to 2019, he was a postdoc fellow at the Center for the Middle Eastern Studies at Harvard University. He was appointed also as Nikit and Eleonora Orjanyan visiting professor at Middle Eastern, South Asian, and African Studies at the Columbia University for spring 2020. Meanwhile, he was research affiliate at History Department at MIT in 2019 to 2020 academic year. He was Kazan visiting professor in Armenian Studies at California State University, Fresno, in fall of 2020, and I heard today that that was on Zoom, as all of us did. His special interests are the history of non-Muslims in the Ottoman Empire and Turkey, intercommunal relations in multi-ethno-religious societies, citizenship and minorities, the history of citizenship and military service. He has been writing a column in Agos, an Istanbul bilingual weekly Armenian newspaper, since 2011. And we are again happy and delighted to welcome today's our speaker, Professor Kilikdahi.
Thank you, Professor Harutyunyan, for this very kind introduction. Before starting, let me also thank the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilization for having me this year as the Dumanian visiting professor. And of course, the biggest thank goes to Dumanian family for establishing this chair and making all these possible, and for giving me the chance to be with you today and through all the quarter. Okay, as you see today, I'm going to talk about conscription of Armenians into the Ottoman Army after the 1908 revolution. But before going into details of this subject, let me provide you some historical and methodological background of this topic. And to do this, my first question will be, why is it important to study military service or conscription? Here, let me show you a quotation from Friedrich Engels from 1891 related to the question, but at the same time also let me try to explain why is it important in my own words. I think to study military service and conscription is important because who serves in the army of a country, of a state, who is drafted, who is not drafted, is an indicator or is a sign of the identity and character of that particular state, okay? In other words, when you examine the scope of military service, you examine the way of governing or governing mentality of that particular state, okay? In other words, preferences in conscription show how that particular state perceives the people under its administration and jurisdiction. And you know, this is true, I don't know, let's say for 18th century as well as today. So looking at conscription in the Ottoman Empire and who was conscripted and who was not, so that also shows the governing mentality of the Ottoman Empire. If you focus in more detailed questions, for example, who are the servicemen, who are the privates, and who are the commanding officers in an army, you will go into the, let's say, detailed or deeper in this mentality. So, therefore, I prefer looking at military service and conscription in Ottoman Empire, indeed to understand that governing mentality of Ottoman Empire, in late Ottoman Empire. You know, from Tanzimat on, Ottoman state and society went through many reforms, and I think one of the most important, maybe the most important phase of that reform is about to transform state-society relations. To put it another way, to create a more or less equal society rather than a hierarchical society based on religious identity. So, and the issue of conscription, of Christians is a topic at which all this debate crystallized, in other words. So looking at those topics then will be, I think, an indicator for all these subjects. Let me also clarify what is or what was special about 1908 or what happened in 1908. It's the second constitutional period, as you know, of the Ottoman Empire. The first Ottoman experience of constitutional monarchy was a short one, as you know, from the last month of 1876 to 1878, when the reigning Abdülhamit II suspended constitution and dismissed the parliament on the pretext of the war with Russia. And following 3 decades after 1878, as you know, he established his despotic regime over the country. And yes, it was like despotic for or totalitarian, whatever, authoritarian government for all, but it was especially a hard and bloody time for Armenians, if you remember all that 1895, 96 massacres, etc. So the reign of Abdülhamit, again, was a difficult time for Armenians. In July 1908, and after a series of events, which are out of the scope of this talk, Abdülhamit had to restore constitution and elections. So it was a time of high expectations, after he had to restore Parliament and Constitution. It was a time of high expectations and, if you like, heyday of Ottomanism that, at least theoretically, assumes everyone as equal citizens regardless of religious affiliations, regardless of ethno-religious identities. And this is an iconic image from the time which shows indeed or symbolizes the expectations, hopes of the people, including Armenians. Here you see masses celebrating the constitution and the restoration of parliament. What you see is that, the Ottoman flag or Turkish flag on which the principles of French Revolution were written in Armenian language and in Armenian script. And this is a perfect sign, is a perfect crystallization, as I said, of the mentality and expectations of the time. But, our topic today is the conscription of Christians. But let me say that conscription of Christians and Jews, in that matter, was not discussed in 1908 for the first time. On the contrary, it was an old debate. Starting from late 1830s, state circles started to debate this issue. In fact, Ottoman bureaucracy in 19th century was divided into two camps, if you like. One supporting the conscription of Christians, the other opposing this idea and project. And it's a detailed subject. It might be a topic of another talk, but let me say that very shortly. Each camp in bureaucracy had its own arguments, but eventually the conservative wing dominated the issue, dominated the matter, and the conscription of Christians was not carried out in 19th century. Only, as an important thing to mention, only in 1856, traditional Islamic tax that collected from Christian and Jewish males under the name of jizya was renamed and returned to military exemption tax, okay? And in other words, on the paper, Christian and Jewish males became liable for military service, but exempted from this service by paying a certain amount of money. Let me underline this. Normally speaking, jizya in Islamic law, as you know, does not have anything to do with military service. This was a maneuver by the Ottoman bureaucracy of the time with different reasons. Some reasons related to relations with great powers of Europe, etc. But at that time, that Ottoman bureaucracy make a shift like this, and they equated jizya with military tax, or they turned jizya into military exemption tax. Here is an important detail, but let me mention that this tax, exemption tax, was not collected from only those who were at the age of military service, but from all Christian and Jewish males up to 70 years old. This is an important detail to understand some, let's say, arguments later in 1908. Okay, now it's time to go to what was discussed or how people reacted in 1908. But before, again, let me show you, or let me give you some clues about my sources, okay? In other words, how do I know what I know, or how do I know what I say here? For this, actually, this is a part of my dissertation, research for my dissertation. And for this research, I, let's say, look at Armenian newspapers, periodicals, published in different locations of Anatolia and also Istanbul, of course. And let me show you some examples of these periodicals or newspapers. This is Haraç from Erzurum. We can say that it's a semi-official organ of Taşnak Sütyun, Armenian Revolutionary Federation in Erzurum. This is another example of periodicals called Yeprat, which is in the organ of Yeprat College in Harput or Harpert, which was an American college established by American missionaries. This is Pütanya from Izmit region. As far as I see, it had no party or partisan ties with any Armenian political party. This is another one, Antranik from Sivas, Sepastia, again an independent initiative. This is again Izmirli from, as you may guess, from the city of Izmir. So I scan all these periodicals and try to understand through articles published there, through news pieces published there, to understand the reaction and mentality of Armenian people about conscription, okay? But besides, I also utilized, as you may guess, Ottoman archives. This is an example of these documents. It's a petition, if you like, written by the Armenian Patriarchate in Istanbul to the Ministry of War about the conscription, and it includes some issues, technical problems, etc., etc. So then my sources, largely speaking, or generally speaking, are those periodicals as well as official documents of the archives. Now, let me turn to, if you like, the content of the discussion. Conscription of Christians and Jews became one of the hot debates after the revolution because, exclusion of any group from military service because of their religious identity, ethno-religious identity, would be contradictory with the equality which was one of the pillars of constitutional regime. Armenians, both masses and political leadership, emerged as one of the most enthusiastic supporters of this idea of extension of conscription to everyone, of course, including Armenians. They mainly presented two reasons for this, one ideological, the other economic one. The ideological reason is that their exclusion from military service would mean the persistence of their secondary status as a people, which would be unacceptable in a constitutional regime. Okay, so this one their ideological approach to the issue. Secondly, they argued that military exemption tax was a heavy financial burden on the shoulder of Armenian people, which they were not able to carry anymore. Okay, so another motivation of theirs was to get rid of this financial burden, an extra financial burden for Armenian people besides other Christians and Jews. As I said, this was not only limited with political leadership or with opinion leaders, but Armenian masses were also enthusiastic about this. In fact, Armenian people in the provinces sent telegrams to the Armenian Patriarchate, Ottoman Parliament, and newspapers in Istanbul demanding immediate abolishment of the tax and extension of military service to all. This is an example I got, from the newspaper Antranik that I showed you. And this is a telegram sent after an extensive meeting, a big rally in Sivas. They sent this telegram to the Ottoman Patriarchate, to the Ottoman Parliament in Istanbul, demanding, as I said, the immediate abolishment of the tax. As I said, it's not only in Sivas. For example, thousands of Armenians gathered also in Harpert on April the 1st and demanded the conscription. And as you see, the date of the rally demonstration in Sivas was March 31st. And according to news and according to Antranik, almost 4,000 Armenians gathered in Sivas for this rally or for this demonstration. And I don't know, another example of this demand, I can mention that on June 23, 130 Armenian shopkeepers in Siirt, or in Armenian Sığert, did not open their shops to protest the persistence of the tax and demanded the conscription of Armenians. So shortly, as a result, I can say that there was a strong push from bottom up, okay, for the abolishment of the tax and extension of conscription to all. Let me mention that the party Tashnak Sutyun, the Armenian Revolutionary Federation, played an important role, played a leading role in organization of these rallies, these demands, these telegram campaigns, etc. But let me also add that this approach or this mentality was not anyway limited with Tashnak Sutyun. Different circles within Armenian community were supporting this idea of conscription or extension of conscription to Armenians and others, including Armenian church and clergy, of which I'm going to give some examples in a minute. Of course, this issue was also discussed in the Ottoman Parliament in long sessions from April to July 1909. The government at the time and some deputies defended that the tax should be collected at least for one more year, since the sudden abrogation of tax would bring about some huge budget deficit for the Ottoman government. Moreover, as an additional argument, they contended that it was not possible to carry out the conscription of Christians and Jews because they were not ready for this. Necessary preparations pertaining to demography, pertaining to registrars, had not been carried out. In other words, they did not have a list of who was eligible for the military service, who was not. So they put forward, if you like, some technical, quote unquote, technical reasons of why they couldn't carry out these conscriptions. On the other hand, Armenian deputies in the parliament, by the way, after the elections in late fall 1908, 10 Armenian deputies had their seat in the parliament. So in that time, we had 10 Armenian deputies in the parliament. So during these discussions about military conscription, all these Armenian deputies, including Hınçak deputies, Tashnak deputies, and let's say liberal deputies, all defended the extension of conscription to all. But especially two deputies were very eager about it. One was Erzurum deputy Ohannes Vartkes, and the other was Istanbul deputy Kirkor Zohrab. So they were strongly opposed this proposal in the parliament, this proposal of delay, okay, in the parliament, and they contended that, and here is a quotation from Kirkor Zohrab from that minutes, they contended that there was no other acceptable solution than immediate and total cancellation of the exemption for anyone. They claimed that providing Ottoman unity was much more important than the budget deficit, okay? They also said that paying fee, the exemption tax, instead of actual military service was at the same time dishonorable. Although it's not our subject today, I should mention that they frequently use this, let's say, masculine arguments also about military service, which was not very different from anywhere or from arguments used by Muslims in Ottoman Empire. So, at the end of long sessions and hot debates, eventually the parliament decided to terminate the exemption tax once and for all on July 12, 1909, okay? But by this legislation, not only rank and files of Ottoman Army, but also military academy was also opened for non-Muslims, Christians and Jewish people. In fact, although we do not have exact numbers because we don't have archives open, let's say, or accessible in Turkey, although we do not have exact numbers, we know that a number of Christians and Jews, including Armenians, entered military academy, graduated from there, and fought in Ottoman Army as commanding officers in the Balkan Wars and in the First World War I. So, Armenian political parties, press, and opinion leaders greeted this decision with joy and excitement, okay? For example, Armenian newspaper Harac, as I say, in Erzurum, described the conscription of Armenians along other non-Muslims as the solid base of constitutional regime and freedom. A correspondent writing from Bulanik, a district of Erzurum, describes the psychology of local Armenians as such, quote, "They breathe a sigh of relief after the exemption tax has been abolished and military service was expanded to all as the necessity of the principle of equality." End of quote. So this is another quotation from the newspaper Izmirli, published in Izmir, as I say, and I think it reflects very well the approach and the mentality of Armenian people at the time. As you see, let me read it. "We are not any longer reaya. We are not any more gavurs or taxpayers either. We are also children of this land. It is also our fatherland, since we are ready to sacrifice our blood to the last drop for the goodness of the country." So as you see clearly here, that will of being equal or considered equal with other, especially of course Muslim subjects or Muslim citizens of the empire. You know, not only Armenian politicians or civil, let's say, quote unquote, civil opinion leaders, but also Armenian church and clergy welcomed the conscription of Armenians and tried to encourage the youth, Armenian youth, and their families for military service. Especially in provinces, they were talking about military service quite passionately, I mean Armenian clergy. For example, religious leader of Harput region, Bishop Aslanyan, gave a lecture at the American college I mentioned of the town, Yeprat College, about military service and tried to prove that Armenians had been and still were talented soldiers through some historical examples referring to Vartan Mamigonyan, who was a mythical figure fighting against Persians, etc., in 5th century, etc. So they tried to create this able soldier Armenian, the image of able soldier Armenian. So they tried to encourage, as I say, Armenian people and Armenian youth and their families. So they tried to show that there was nothing to be afraid of to be in the army. This is their perspective. So the Bishop Aslanyan encouraged the Armenian youngs to take this distinguished responsibility heartily as Ottomans. And this is his terminology. Maybe I should say in quotation. And you know, again, another example, this is a declaration by the Armenian prelacy of Erzurum as the highest regional authority of Erzurum. I'm not gonna read it word by word, But again, it shows that this approach or this enthusiasm was not restricted with political leaders or whatever intellectuals. Okay, until this moment, I tried to describe this enthusiasm, this eagerness, this joy about military service. But let me say that this was only one face of the coin. Because on the other face, if you like, of the coin, there were some fears and apprehensions of the Armenian community, which can be summarized under these headlines, if you like, or titles. In other words, everything was not so smooth or unproblematic. Armenian community had not had a collective memory and experience transferred from older generations about being soldier, about being in the army. They didn't know anything about military life in barracks, okay? So if you like, this kind of lack of collective memory created a kind of worrisomeness, or let's say a kind of apprehension, some apprehensions, okay? Let me show you an I think, interesting booklet. This is a booklet written by an anonymous Armenian. It's, you know, he used a nickname called Anmeruk, immortal. And this is a booklet describing the military life in barracks and tried to inform coming Armenian soldiers about what they would face in the army. It gives some details about maneuvers. It tries to prove that how the relations between Armenian soldiers and Muslim soldiers were good, were friendly, they were like brothers, etc., etc. So what I'm trying to say is that this lack of information transferred from older generations, this created this atmosphere of quote-unquote fear or apprehension, okay? Especially those at the age of active duty and their families were anxious about what will happen to them in the army. Let me turn to this list. About what will happen to them in the army. How would their commanders and peers meet and treat them? They had the fear of being harassed in the army or even beaten by their peers or by their commanders. They were also worried about the physical conditions of army life, physical conditions of barracks. Would there be enough and edible food? Would they get sick? What about heating in the winter? So these are the problems or articulations I came across through these periodicals, through these or articles published in these periodicals. So they had such kind of thoughts and concerns about military life, okay? Another hesitation, as you see on the board, another hesitation was about the economic future of Armenian soldiers. Active duty lasted for 3 years, from the age 21 to 23, and most of the Armenian youngsters would leave their job or business to go to military service, to perform military service. So they asked, would they be able to resume what they left 3 years after, having all these years in the army? So they had this kind of, again, concerns. Another major fear was forced or semi-voluntary conversion to Islam. So Christian soldiers may have been pushed or harassed again to convert once they entered the barracks. Especially clergy and patriarchate were worrying about this. They proposed to employ permanent priests, okay, in the army as a measure to prevent conversions, forced conversions. But actually the Ottoman state, the Ottoman government, did not accept this proposal of employing permanent Christian clergy in the army. And let me remind you that there had been already imams, Muslim clergy in each battalion. So it was an habitual practice to employ Muslim clergy, but the Ottoman government rejected this proposal to employ Christian clergy and Jewish clergy, let's say, besides Muslim clergy. I think this is important. Even they accepted to have Christian commanders, commanding officers, but they staunchly rejected to have priests or rather rabbis in the army. I think this is an important thing. It's an important clue to understand that mentality and to understand the identity of Ottoman army. As a footnote, maybe we can go into details about this topic in Q&A. Employment of priests or Christian clergy was important not only to prevent conversions, but also to meet the religious needs of Christian soldiers. Indeed, this was another issue of bargain between the state and Christian clergy and Jewish clergy. At the end, the state, as I said, did not accept employing Christian and Jewish clergy, but agreed to give partial and conditional leave of absence to Christian and Jewish soldiers for weekly and, let's say, annual holidays. Okay, so from their perspective, this was a concession, if you like, given to Christian and Jewish soldiers and Armenian clergy. Lastly, I should mention technical but vital problems as date of birth of candidate soldiers. Ottoman IDs or birth certificates were not so dependable, as the dates of birth might have been recorded wrongly, which means that people might be drafted too young or too old. This was again a critical issue, especially for the families whose sons would be conscripted. Again, after negotiations and bargains, the Ministry of War agreed to use church records as a reference point, as the Patriarchate ensured that dates were recorded there precisely. Every child was supposed to be baptized, and whenever that child was brought to the church, all dates about him or her were recorded at churches. So through this practice then, these records indeed became a part of official registrar, official, if you like, data to be used in the conscription of Christians and Armenians. However, despite all these problems or worries or let's say fears, conscription of Christians and Jews was carried out, at least initially, without a major problem or a systematic problem. Although we do not have exact official numbers, the data we collect from the press of the time might give an idea. I just scanned these newspapers, and the newspaper Jamanak in Istanbul published the list of Armenian conscripts from November 1909 to January 1910. So I scanned all these lists and just sum up the numbers, sum up the names of conscripts, and I see that more than 1,500, slightly more than 1,500 Armenians were conscripted from Istanbul, only Istanbul, into regular or reserve forces of the Ottoman Army in this time range, meaning that from November 1909 to January 1910. Again, when I scanned through the newspapers, provincial newspapers, I saw that in June 1910, again more than 1,100 Armenians were drafted this time from Sivas province. So although, I mean, these numbers are not enough, of course, are not sufficient to reach a definite conclusion, but we can say that despite all these problems, despite all these negotiations, etc., at least the first round of conscription carried out without major or systematic problem. Now, let me finish my talk by underlying, if you like, a bitter irony of history, I can say. So what can we infer from all these? I mean, how can we interpret all these? I think one of the obvious conclusions is that Armenian political leadership of the time made their political investment in the Ottoman state, clearly. In other words, especially, again, Tashnak Sutyun, the Armenian Revolutionary Federation, but not only Tashnak Sutyun, the whole, I can say, the whole Armenian political leadership, metaphorically speaking, put their chips on the unity and continuity of the Ottoman Empire after 1908. This explains why these deputies were so eager, were so enthusiastic to defend the conscription of Armenians into the army, okay? In other words, I can say that it seems they envisioned a future within the Ottoman Empire. Contrary to some, let's say, claims in historiography, I think their attitude clearly shows their perspective about the future of Armenian people within the Ottoman Empire. What is the bitter irony I mentioned? I think it's a bitter irony of the history, of course, for which we cannot blame Armenian politicians of the time from looking here, from talking from here in 2022. But when they fervently defended the conscription of Armenians in the parliament in 1909, they, of course, unwittingly took a step which facilitated the annihilation of Armenian peoples 6 years later. Why? Basically, because of two reasons which were related to them. First of all, when the First World War was declared, or mobilization was declared in October 1914, as all other Ottomans, Armenian young people were also conscripted into the army. And otherwise it will be very difficult to find all these young people together to massacre. And they would have been dispersed to all the villages across all Anatolia. And secondly, again related to this, since these young people were conscripted, all the towns, cities, and villages remained more defenseless against all this practice of deportation coming in 1915. So it is here is the irony. When Kirkor Zohrab or Oannes Vartkes were talking about conscription of Armenians in 1909, indeed, unwittingly, unknowingly, they were facilitating the deportations and massacres of Armenian people. But of course, who can blame them? They, as I say, they put their hopes and all these expectations on the Ottoman Army and the Ottoman state, and of course, Committee of Union and Progress, or aka Ittihadist people. But eventually this turned to be a doomed, if you like, expectation at the end. Okay, let me stop here. Thank you for your patience. If you have any questions, I'm going to try to answer them. Thank you. Sure.
So, were there any station of assimilation or promoting their level of citizenship, participation in the army, except for what later happened in did it somehow work for them?
Actually, assimilation or the fear of assimilation was one of the important motivations, if you like, among Armenian political leadership, including Armenian clergy and Armenian church. And they always underline the importance of preserving ethnic identities. They not necessarily did not use the term ethnic, but they underline the importance of Armenian language, Armenian identity, Armenian religion. And for the sake of, as a measurement, as a counter-measurement against assimilation, they underlined communal autonomy in some civil affairs, indeed, which was not new, within the administrative mentality of Ottoman Empire. They, in other words, underlined the continuity of communal autonomy, as well as regional and administrative decentralization, ademi merkeziyet. So when you look at all these articles, all these newspapers, again, from all circles of the Armenian political spectrum, okay, you will see this argument about communal autonomy and regional autonomy. So these are some countermeasures against assimilation, and also, as I say, they feared about conversion to Islam in the army. This is also related about their concern about assimilation, okay? So that's why they try to, if you like, have a protective wall of protection, if you like, around Christian soldiers through Christian clergy as the permanent personnel in the army.
I have a question about the logistics of this conscription. So in 1909, they started already to conscribe also the Armenians, right? So they had 3 years, I guess, youngsters from 21 to 23 went to training, like military training. But then when World War I started, so they would mobilize everyone. So were they mobilizing also all of these Armenians that never went through this military service and were not trained, and because they were above the age of 23?
Actually, the actual service was for 3 years, but every male was also supposed to serve in reserve forces for another 3 years, from age 23 to 26. So as I said, we do not have these exact numbers province by province. I mean, who was conscripted, I mean, which Armenians, if you like, was conscripted in the provinces. But most probably, first, those Armenians who served previously, but in the reserve forces by 1914, I think must have been conscripted first. But, very shortly, as you know, these Armenians were transferred to labor battalions, and they just were massacred in labor battalions. My guess is that first these reserve forces should have been conscripted, but again, we don't have exact numbers and exact profile of Armenian soldiers in the Ottoman Army in the eve of First World War. Yeah. Sure.
Yeah, your sources. I actually have a few questions.
Sure.
So in the first slide, the petition from 4 or so, presumably Armenians, that appeared in the yes,
This
here.
one, yeah.
Thank you. Completely powerless to pay the exemption tax. Was it increased at the same time that it was changed from the jizya?
Decreased, you mean?
Powerless to pay these, wouldn't they have been paying it before?
Yeah, they were, as I said, as an important detail, as I said, this tax had been paid by not only those at the age of military service, but all males. And as another, if you like, detailed, this tax, military exemption tax, had been collected in a collective basis. In other words, each communities was responsible to pay a lump sum as the military tax, rather than each single male was responsible to pay a certain amount, okay? But when they calculated that lump sum, they considered all males up to 70 years old, not only just these youngsters between 21 and between 20 and 23, etc. So let's assume an Armenian village, you have 500 Armenian males from 17 to, I think, 70. They count all these men when they calculated the tax, the lump sum to be paid by that certain village. Okay? So again, as an argument, sincerity is another issue, but as an argument, after 1908, Armenian people were complaining that they were not any longer able to pay this tax. Okay, so again, this was a financial burden in their description.
I think people complained before that the jizya was a...
Yeah, exactly,
So that part isn't new.
Yeah, I mean, people always complaining about taxes.
I was also curious about the title, because it's in quotes. Where is that?
It's from Kirko Zohrab, or a kind of, let's say, a slightly different version of this, learning to live. This is just quotation from Kirko Zohrab. This is what exactly he said in the parliament. Learning to live together requires dying together. This is just a discursive argument, let's say, used by Zohrab in the parliament. Yeah.
Thank you for this nice presentation. I was wondering, so you showed us like the perspective from the Armenian church, this Grigor Zakab, intellectuals and then masses. I was wondering, have you encountered any like petition or ideas from Armenians from Iran or Russia? I mean, as Armenians from outsider, how they perceive this like new development? I mean, they're part of like the bigger community.
So you ask their approach about conscription of Armenians in the Ottoman Empire. Good question, but unfortunately, I haven't come across any comment by, let's say, foreign Armenians, and Armenians with foreign nationality about conscription of Armenians in the Ottoman Empire. So I'm thinking, but no, I couldn't, at least in these newspapers, in these periodicals, I didn't come across any piece of information about it. Thank you.
Speaking about the period, I was wondering, since you said first there was this reports about Armenians being conscripted at the first, during the first term. So was there any follow-up, like 3 or 6 years later, about sharing their experiences to keep conversation?
This was a time of first excitement, if you like. It was the first time that they were conscripted. You can observe this excitement, this joy through all the pages. I mean, I just referred to some numbers, but you can come across many articles, newspapers describing the festivities, festivity-like organizations on the streets of Istanbul celebrating this, Armenians by let's say many groups just were celebrating this news with bands, with singing on the street. So they were so enthusiastic about it. So they also started to publish memoirs of Armenian soldiers whom they were conscripted first, okay? If you like, you can have some interviews with these Armenians about their experience in the army, about their experience or memories in the barracks. So, in other words, as I say, since they hadn't had a previous memory about it, they tried to create a memory as soon as possible, to make it some known experience to all Armenians, okay? I didn't, search let's say, newspapers from 1913, 1914, most probably, of course, the first wave would be, let's say, extinguished. But during this first wave, first excitement, you can see pages of descriptions about military life, about how Armenians experience this military life, etc., etc. Yeah.
Well, I just relate to what you were asking. It seems to me that by the time you get through the first 3 years, exclusionary years of the Balkan War,
Yeah.
that's a whole other, that's a whole other moment, you know. And I guess my question was related to that in the sense that there is this enthusiasm on the part of the Armenians, but I think enthusiasm, at least on the part of some, certainly on the part of the Jewish community, and I think also on the part of a substantial part of the Muslim community about the revision of the Constitution. But the defeat of the Balkan Wars changes everything.
Yeah, exactly.
And I just wondered, how noticeable that is to you in what you read in the Armenian press.
I didn't come across much about in Armenian sources, but I know that from other sources, some people, some Muslim intellectuals, tried to blame, let's say, Christian soldiers in the army for the Balkan defeat. Although we have other memoirs, I don't remember the name of that officer, but describing how Armenian soldiers were fighting heroically in Yanya, for example, etc. Although we have such kind of memories, exactly as you say, these Balkan wars came as a blow, about all this optimism, about this brotherhood in arms, etc. You know what, just I remember I would expect a question about Adana massacres in 1909, because it overlapped exactly or more or less with the debates in the parliament about conscription. And one may expect after these Adana massacres that these Armenian deputies should have, let's say, lost their appetite for the conscription. But on the contrary, from their perspective, Adana massacres were another proof of why Armenians should have taken their parts in the army. Because according to this, let's say, approach, if Armenians had been in the army as officers and soldiers during the Armenian massacres, Adana massacres, most probably, according to their perspective, most probably these massacres would have not happened. Because as you know, second waves of massacres in Adana were executed by the army, by the Ottoman Army. So this kind of events, or let's say massacres against Armenians, just encouraged these people more, okay, for the conscription of Armenians into the army. In other words, it would be another guarantee of protecting revolution, protecting constitution, and protecting equality.
Do you think that, I mean, just out of curiosity, that specifically in the context of the Adana massacre, do you think that's from the perspective of saying if the community had been more fully integrated as citizens, this would happen because the constitutional brotherhood would have reigned? Or do you think the attitude was that if more Armenians had been in the army would have been incapable of carrying out such a program?
I don't think that it would be a definitive measure to prevent such kind of massacres, etc. Anyway, Adana massacres, in that sense, was too early, okay, in that chronologically speaking, to integrate all these Armenian soldiers and officers, into the army. But this was their logic. This was their way of thinking rather than actual situation. I think, for specifically Adana massacres, it was very complicated, related to economic developments in Cilicia region, etc., etc. So,
About people who are writing this
Yeah.
should be more than enough.
They just, I can say, used it as another argument to prove their approach or to prove their project idea about it. But if you ask my opinion, I don't think that just having Armenian soldiers in the army would have prevented just Armenian massacres or other Adana massacres, etc.
This might be interesting to you. There's a book, now about 10 or 15 years old, in American history by a historian Linda Kerber, called The Constitutional Right to be a Lady.
Yeah.
Sort of thinks about these issues with respect to.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's why I said in the beginning that who is conscripted, who is not, is just an indicator, is a sign, as an evidence about that particular state. I mean, and you can apply this to many different segments of society, as you say, women, or I would say conscription of African Americans into the American United States Army. It was a debate for long years, even after the Second World War, etc. Or I don't know, Durzi people in Israel, you can give other examples, or Jewish people in European armies. So, of course, this was not something peculiar to Armenians, Ottoman Armenians and Ottoman Army. As I say, this, as Friedrich Engels says, this conscription became a much more important indicator of democracy beginning in 19th century and, of course, through whole 20th century. Even today, when you look at, I don't know, United States Army and who fights in the Army of United States today, I don't know, they propose citizenship, those immigrant people, if they serve, I don't know, for certain years.
I think the case today in this army is just the opposite. It's the mercenary army.
Yeah.
And so the argument is, anybody who'll take the paycheck can fight. In fact, I think a few years ago there was a general, I wish I could remember his name, who proposed that the United States Army should go to, sub-Saharan Africa and just recruit whoever there needed a job into the American Army.
Again, this is also an indicator about the character of what is becoming, okay, what the United States is becoming. Also, this is an indicator about this, I think. So it's always important whom you conscript to fight. This was and I think will be an important point to understand this state-society relations, I think.
Yeah, a question about your archives of choice. Were there many, because you showed us a civil document, a petition, and the newspapers, were there many, reports by officers, military documents, or would this, with the status of Armenians, not have been something worth recording?
Actually, no, I didn't come across many documents, many official documents about these problems or questions. But as I showed, I found a few petitions written by the Armenian Patriarchate to the Ministry of War about some problems, some technical details. For example, they tried to prove that, as I said, these church records were dependable enough for the sake of conscription, etc. But in terms of quantity, if I can answer your question, in terms of quantity, I couldn't find many documents in the Ottoman archives related to the issue of conscription of Armenians. And until this day, as I said, I don't know if they had these documents, but I can say that the official circles, let's say in Turkey, I don't know, haven't opened these documents, these records for researchers, assuming that they have these records. So that's why, for example, we do not have the list of Armenians and other non-Muslims entering military academy. This shouldn't be so difficult to have this list, but of course it's related to the official ideology in Turkey, etc. But even it's not possible to access this kind of simple quantitative data. Or how many Armenians were conscripted by province by province? This shouldn't have been so difficult to have this list. Nothing complicated, just a list. We do not have even numbers. So in terms of official archives, if you like, we have a considerable gap in this issue.
Are there, it's following what you just said, are there any cases of Armenians who joined the army and had a career and they were able to get to higher ranks and to have a successful career?
I cannot say whether it was successful or not, but although few examples, we know that there are some Armenian officers who fought even until the end of the war. For example, Kalust Sürmenyan. Actually, his memoirs were published in Turkish by Tarih Vakfı History Foundation. So also military doctors, Armenian and or Greek or other non-Muslims, there were many military doctors performing duties in, for example, Dardanelles. There's the war in Dardanelles, etc. So again, I cannot say whether they were successful or not, but we know that there were.
That's what I mean. They weren't blocked to make their way to the higher ranks if they wanted.
Actually, I mean, again, there were some performing their duties until the end of war, but at the same time, we know that some officers were also executed, for example. In other words, there is not a consistent picture. In some cases, they were executed. In some cases, they continued to, let's say, perform their duties until the end of the war.
But I don't think they rose high.
Yeah.
I mean, I think they survived to be in the war in place.
Yeah.
But I don't think they were promoted, to general, for example.
No, not general, but I don't know, captains. I think there were captains, captains, or lieutenants. Lieutenants, we know that there were Armenian lieutenants and captains. And in terms of military doctors, they had higher ranks, but they were not in combatant forces, these military doctors. In that case, they have sometimes called pasha, but again, they were not in combatant forces.
I think there was some pressure, at least in some people, towards the end of the war to convert, nominally convert, to nominally profess to be Muslims in order to continue the place. I've got that in some memoirs anyway.
Actually, I mean, although it's not related to our issue, I also served in Turkish army, and I was offered to be circumcised. This was not in 19th century, in the 20th century. This was 2007. So this kind of practices did not go away very easily.
Also in Israel, we had 1.5 million new immigrants since the Soviet Union collapsed. They have Jewish background, and there are other minorities in the Israeli army, but it's a matter of integration or young people. They don't want to be different than each other, and sometimes they have some pressure to conform to some kind of not necessarily convert your.
Yeah, it's not. It might not be an official ideology to push conversion, but there is something called peer push or peer, let's say, peer pressure coming from your equivalents, if you like, is a horizontal pressure rather than coming from higher ranks. But it's also a reality. It's a fact. It's a pressure on people to convert. Yes.
I just wanted to ask you, how about, like, in terms of compare and contrast, you have, like, the Jewish community, what was their attitude, and how many of theirs were recruited or conscripted into the Ottoman Empire, the Greeks, the Armenians, and other minorities. Compare and contrast, what was their attitude, how many of them, and what cadres, whether the officer class, the runs, the infantry.
Actually, I didn't myself make research about Greeks and Jews in this issue, but I may refer to some other works of my colleagues. For example, Uğur Zekeriya Peçe wrote about Greek conscription of Greeks in the same period. And through his work, I can say that more or less the attitude among Greeks was similar to Armenians. Again, they showed some enthusiasm, like Armenians do, about conscription. But maybe I can say that Greek patriarchate, if I may use this word, was cooler, okay, about the idea compared to Armenian patriarchate. But overall speaking, if I compare again through Peche's work and my research, I wouldn't say that there is a considerable difference or they were going into opposite directions. But I may only say that, as I say, this Greek clergy, let's say, was cooler compared to Armenian clergy in this issue. As for Jewish community, I'm thinking about, there is an article written by Elia Ginyo, I think, but it was about Jewish experience, if I'm not wrong, in Balkan Wars. So, I mean, I don't remember anything about Jewish community to compare and to say anything about it.
There's, in Sarah Stein's book, Making Jews Modern, I think she talks about, she's not studying conscription, but she's studying the press.
Yeah.
And I think what she discusses there, that very much this rhetoric of, you know, we must be good citizens, we must demonstrate that we are good citizens, and you know, making ourselves available for conscription is an important part.
I mean, as for Ottomanism, all this Ottoman ideology, all these people, I mean, non-Muslims, were eager about it, were joyful about it, were enthusiastic about it. If you look at the works by, I don't know, Bedros Dermatosyan, for example, he researched about the reception of revolution in Jerusalem, in Middle East, and here you can see that all these people, Arab people, Jewish people, Armenian people, without any exception in that sense, were supporting the revolution, and these new principles supposedly would bring a more democratic society. So all were eager about it. Yeah. Sure.
Maybe one more question about so since the military cadre is preparing for a second constitutional period, so since they are actually leaders of underground organizations in the military, I would have just expected them to, as this shift into having non-Muslims being conscripted into the army is happening, I would just expect them to also pave the way for new kind of publications for the Muslim participants in the army to kind of be ready to be able to better embrace, just propaganda publications to embrace your non-Muslim brothers.
You have a good sense because in these newspapers you can come across some, again, articles and interviews from the mouth of Muslim soldiers in the army, saying that, for example, our officers explained to us that our new brothers, Christian brothers, would join us. We were ready for them. We are ready for them. So we were instructed that nothing will happen. So you are right in that sense. Officers in the army tried to prepare Muslim soldiers for their new friends coming in let's say, Christian friends. So in other words, although, again, it's not my subject today, apprehensions or fears or concerns of Muslim soldiers who were already in the army was also another subject matter, okay, in this topic. Yeah, you are right in that sense. They tried to prepare also Muslim soldiers for this novelty, okay, in the army. That's why, for example, here in this booklet, this soldier Anmiruk tried to show how their relations with their Muslim friends were so good. For example, as the first article, they published a letter written by a Muslim soldier, okay, celebrating this new friendship. So again, you are right, this is another important issue on the side of Muslim soldiers.
Were there any other complications later that they blamed you for being a fifth column?
I think we can come across such things later, 3-4 years later, but I did not expand my research to that point, chronologically speaking.
So did the Ottoman Empire publish any book on military in Armenian language? Do we have any booklet?
Good question. I don't know. I didn't come across. No. Maybe, I don't know. Maybe if I or other scholars continue to search one, but even I didn't come across any expression, any article mentioning that kind of material. So most probably there was not any, but who knows?
My last question.
Sure.
Small. You mentioned that even nowadays the Turkish government policy is not to expose the records if there are any. I guess it has to do with Armenian identity more than any other thing. But is that a different case for Jews, for example?
No, not. It's same for Jews, Greeks, and Armenians. Again, we do not know how many Armenians, Greeks, and Jews were accepted into the military academy. It's, yeah, exactly, and it's another detailed story, but it's related to the official Turkish ideology about, all this story about the establishment of Turkish Republic, etc., and all these narration or narrative about Turkish Republic against imperialism and all these non-Muslims as collaborators of imperialism, etc. So publishing this kind of lists, if you like, or let's say putting evidence about conscription of non-Muslims into the army or into the military academy, I think would, let's say, ruin, would damage this kind of narratives. I think this is the motivation. Of course, it's debatable.
Explain what the logic, how does it damage it? I see it as something that is...
Because, this, very briefly speaking,
equality.
Because, very briefly speaking, let's say, these circles, these non-Muslim circles were, or have been depicted until this day as the enemies, quote unquote, enemies of nation, enemies of state, traitors, collaborators of foreign powers, etc. Suddenly, if you show that these people were fighting in Dardanelles against imperialism within the Ottoman Army, then you would seem contradictory or inconsistent. It will be an inner inconsistency in your narrative, basically speaking, Yeah. So that's why they continue to deny, let's say, the existence of Armenian commanders or officers and soldiers in the Ottoman Army. Or, I don't know, how this official ideology legitimizes deportations by saying that Armenian people, Armenian gangs were collaborating with the enemy. But if you show that tens of thousands of Armenians had been already conscripted in the army in the fall 1914, then after that point it will be difficult to defend your narrative about this treason, etc.
So it's a matter of excluding minorities from the fame of the...
Yeah, fame of...
appropriation of...
Yeah, basically, this is... So, for a long time, even the existence or the presence of Armenians and others in the history, in the Ottoman history and the history of Anatolia have been erased or have been forgotten. Not only Armenian soldiers or officers. So again, this is, I think, a part of this official myth, if you like, official narrative about Turkish identity and the character, the identity of Turkish Republic.
But I sense from you that what you're trying to say is not that they were forgotten because they were marginalized and their story wasn't interesting. They were actively forgotten.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. They, if you like, they have been forgotten on purpose, not in time, not by time. They have been forgotten on purpose, in other words. Yeah.
Also, generally, it used to be, but I think it's still true, that the archival things relating to the Ministry of War and war operations are largely closed.
Yeah.
It's very hard to get anything having to do with the military operations.
More than 100 years ago.
Yeah. I said it's difficult to have statistics about Armenian soldiers or Christian soldiers, but let me also add that it's also difficult, for example, to learn the exact number of death toll, total death toll in the Dardanelles, or let's say in the First World War. This is also another fact about archives.
That's universal for all
Yeah.
We just cover it up.
Yeah. Yeah.
Even now,
Yeah, that's what I said.
that's what we see.
Yeah.
How many people died in Ukraine?
Well, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for listening. Thank you for your patience. Thank you.